To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
We're currently living in the late stages of Game A, a civilization powered by democracy, science, and finance. That has done incredible things, but has now hit a hard planetary boundary. We're trapped in a system where the only rule for what gets built next is money on money return, leading to a world of addiction, alienation, and ecological decay. In this conversation, Jim and I explore the exit strategy, minimum necessary radicalism. It's a framework for a fourth epoch of humanity, Game B. We discuss why revolutions usually fail by going too far and why reforms fail by doing nowhere near enough. And we dive into the architecture of this new world, membranes that act as social laboratories, growth through forking to prevent cults and corruption, and liquid democracy to restore our ability to actually make sense of the world. This is about moving from a world of the big men and status games to a society organized around human well-being and ecological flourishing. It's time to take a bigger swing. I hope you have fun with today's conversation. What about minimum necessary radicalism?
That's a good one. That's one I have not talked about hardly at all, except amongst the Game B insiders.
Yeah, let's go there then.
All right, let's talk about it. That's an important one, and I'm going to do a whole essay on it, even though it seems pretty obscure. And when I use the term, and as I said, I'm not sure I've ever used the term outside of the actual inner Game B community. If I have, I don't remember. And the concept is all three words are of equal importance. Viable, minimum necessary.
Necessary, yeah.
Minimum necessary radicalism. Let's start with the words in that order. Minimum is absolutely critical because most revolutions go too far, right? The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution, one of the few that didn't, but it's not the way to bet. Most of the time, these things get captured by, bad people who are serving their own agendas, and who knows what happens. They go too far. They, line people up, send them to camps, kill people. So once from the very beginning, the Game B revolution should be to do no more than it needs to do. On the other hand, necessary is also absolutely critical, and in our classic everyday reformist politics, the tendency is to do nowhere near enough, right? You have Trump's crypto reserve currency. That doesn't change anything fundamental. It's a little bit around the edges. Do an antitrust action against Google, make them. They didn't even make them do it. They didn't even make them divest their browser. But even if they did, it's just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
And then radicalism is the third term, and it's also equally important. You really got to think this thing through from first principles, and not just try to. It's funny, you're doing both. You're adjusting your way, because this is another topic closely related. I'll throw this one in too, which is epistemic humility and limits to knowledge. And this is also, I think that's actually the title of one of the other essays. Because we have to realize that we're dealing with complex systems, and our ability to predict the future of complex systems is limited by all kinds of things, some of them practical, some of them fundamental. And so one needs to be cognizant of the fact that we're experimenting our way forward rather than, here's the plan, we're going to go do this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we believe that the time of micro adjustments only is over. It requires a bigger swing to really move the world to a different attractor that can actually survive for the next 10,000 years and go on to our glorious future. And by the way, that conversation we had actually triggered a bunch of new thinking for me, and maybe even a whole new lobe on the Game B story on why are we doing this, right? Because it's funny. We said, well, we want a civilization that is organized around human well-being and ecological flourishing. But there's a bigger point than that, which is I say this is Jim's star. I want this thing that started with the Big Bang as a simple physics thing. It's come through 28 levels of emergence, at least, probably more. And I want this thing to go on to infinity, bring the universe to life. It may be, this is very important, that only humans have the opportunity to do this. We might be it. This is, of course, the Fermi paradox, which I talk about a fair bit, which is maybe we're totally alone as a technological society. Maybe they're common, or maybe it's something in between. But until we know which way it is, we better be damn careful not to fuck up this chance for the universe to come to life.
Yeah, I like those two directions. Either we have to know how to deal with the rest of life, or we are responsible for bringing life into the universe. I agree with that. But let's go back to our three terms. So the first two are qualifiers, dimensional qualifiers of the third. So let's first unpack radicalism, because you started by equivocating radicalism with thinking from first principles. But I think there's more richness to that term, and it encompasses more. What do you think of when you think of radicalism?
In particular, in this case, I have a model of the arc of history, of human history. It has three parts so far. So small number. First was the era of egalitarianism, probably 290,000 years of human history. We lived as forager people. We self-managed. We were not controlled by chiefs or big men, etc. Then, with the development of agriculture and nomadism, and in some odd cases, aquaculture and a few other things, the first game started to end. It didn't end everywhere. Still people playing the first game, the egalitarian game, not too many. But what I look at is the transition to the big man game started. Chiefs in particular, Forager Bandit, the Dunbar number of 150, doesn't need a chief. It has people who are role-based leaders. You're the guy who hunts the rabbits. The woman who's the expert at finding tubers leads the tuber hunts. Who got the nose for finding the antelope. He leads the antelope hunt. The shaman is the one that does the religious ceremonies, but nobody is a general leader that tells people what to do. And if we look in one of my very favorite books, Chris Boehm's Hierarchy in the Forest, he goes into great detail on how we were able to preserve the egalitarian culture for most of our history, despite the fact that we're descendant from horrendous hierarchical killer apes. Right? Chimpanzees are nasty motherfuckers. Bonobos have a bit of a better reputation, but they're not much better, as it turns out. But this forager operator system allowed us to not tolerate the big men to try to suppress us. Everybody honored their integrity. And one of Boehm's theories is that it was weapons that allowed that. The biggest, toughest chimp can physically, and with one or two assistants, can intimidate a whole tribe of chimps. But two dudes with a spear can kill the biggest guy around. And so, his thought is just that. So, but then once the power of agriculture and accumulated surplus became a thing, it allowed the emergence of the big man. And it's almost always men. Occasionally, less than 1%, it's a female. It's almost always men. A chief, a priest, who has broad power, often hereditary or kin-based, always is recruiting henchmen. Because again, from a game theory perspective, you're just one dude. So guys with the spears can kill you. But if I get enough henchmen together, then any likely upstart that wants to overthrow the big man and return to egalitarian rule will fail. And we basically had growing big man rule for the next 10,000 years. And let's say by 1500, that was how the world was run, pretty much. 1500 AD. We had empires, we had warlords, we had kings, we had princes, we had nobilities that may or may not have been parts of bigger states. But essentially, everything was controlled by one person or a very small number of people saying so. The economy was based on monopolies, typically granted by these big men. Politics was closed to everybody except the big men and their closest relatives. The land was often owned by the big men. It was what we did for a very long time. So that's epoch number 2. Then epoch number 3, which we'll call Game A, started somewhere around 1500. And in my telling of the story, really got rolling in a limited area in Western Europe, Southern England and the Netherlands mostly, by about 1700, by about 1800, by about 1700, 1700. And the elements that brought being a pure big man world to the Game A world is we developed intellectual and political institutional tools that allowed us to leverage shared decision making. It no longer was just the big man. Some of the dates I use for that are 1688 in England, the Glorious Revolution, where the old king was kicked out and new king was invited in. But this king was not an absolute king. He was a constitutional monarch under the authority of the parliament. And the parliament was not universal suffrage by any means. It was people of means, aristocrats, something just below aristocrats. But they actually voted. They sent delegates, and that parliament controlled the king. And so that was part of what helped England take off. It could make better decisions. The problem with the king game is, I was watching a good show about the American Revolution the other day, and I think it was Thomas Paine said, the fallacy of the traditional kingdom is it thinks that you often think you're appointing a lion when you're actually appointing an ass, right? It's the oldest son, and it's just a roll of dice. Maybe he's good, maybe he's not. But if you have Parliament actually making the final decisions, probably a better chance. The second one was science, huge. Also in the same epoch, in the 17th century, humanity had been plagued by appeals to authority essentially forever. A few exceptions. There was a little flash in Athens around the time of Aristotle and some of the other good people. There was a flash in the Middle East. There was a small flash in China at various times. There was a minor resurgence in Spain under the Moors, but in general, it never lasted. It lasted a generation or two at the most. But something happened in the 17th century, again, in the same place. All shit happened in the same place. That actual reproducible quality ratchets of knowledge could happen in a collaborative fashion. And part of it was technology, the printing press, right? The Republic of Letters, as it was called. They would print these proto-journals and send a couple hundred copies around Europe, and people would read what other people are thinking. And they somehow established a tradition of arguing rather than fighting. I can't prove Newton can't prove his rules of gravitation by beating up Leibniz, right? He's got to do it intellectually, honestly. And that had never been a thing before for any period of time. And so science is a cooperative, truth-seeking enterprise. It ain't perfect, makes mistakes a lot, but it also has built-in self-correction mechanism. And then the third one may have been the most powerful of all, but all three are hugely powerful. And that was the invention of modern finance. And you can roughly put that also at the end of the 17th century. I like to use the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. There was also a Bank of Amsterdam a little bit before that, where instead of the king saying this is what the weight's going to be in the coins, or you're going to be taxed, this much, or fix the prices, slowly, the information started to become accumulated in markets. And we'll get to the critique of Game A. We're going to say that went too far in some sense. But that was a huge advantage over everybody else in the world. And if you go back and look at the timeline of history, Europe was just another power in 1650. It pushed a few people around, but it didn't dominate the world. By 1800, it dominated the world. How did that happen? Because it had those three engines. It had proto-democracy, modern science, the beginnings, and eventually more than the beginnings of finance. And that unleashed human creativity at a level never, ever, ever, ever seen before. As an example, the population of the world in 1700 was 650 million people. 650 million people. Now, today we're at 8, 9, something like that, headed for 10 or 11. Never, ever been a takeoff like that. And of those people, 650 million in the world, 625 million, most of them were dirt poor. 50% of the kids died before they were 5. People had no glass in their windows. They had 2 pieces of clothes if they lived in the temperate region, probably had no clothes if they lived in the tropics. Humanity was just not in a great shape at that point. But those 3 things essentially came together and took off. But so those are 3 big epochs of human history. And so I'm proposing that game B is the 4th. Very radical, which is to say that the 3 things that game A created, in principle, added value. But 2 mistakes were made. One is they did not break the big man game. It may not have been doable at the time. Big men, weren't quite as big as they were, because constitutional monarch as opposed to an absolute monarch. But the money power certainly allowed big men to achieve lots of power. And so we didn't go back to the egalitarian game. We kept a lot of aspects of the big man game. And then, again, look at 650 million people approximately. Our impact on the Earth was relatively small. And there was like a 12th as many people, and each one consumed about a 12th as many resources as we do. Like the world average of consumption. So between them, 150th of the impact on the Earth. So the amount of harm that humans could do in 1700 against the Earth was tiny, really. And so you let the thing go, and it made people's lives better and richer, and their kids stopped dying. They put glass in their windows. They had suits of clothes. They had clean water. They eventually, surprisingly late in the day, realized you shouldn't shit upstream from where you get your drinking water. It wasn't until 1900 that was conventional wisdom, believe it or not. Science that gave us that one. But you put anything on an exponential curve in a finite planet, and guess what? You eventually hit the boundary. And we have now hit the boundary. It's a ridiculous percentage of all the large mammals on Earth that are humans and their livestock. 70% birds, I think it's 80% of the total mass of birds on Earth are domestic poultry. What the hell? It can't go on too much further than that. And again, when you are growing wheat to make bread for people and things like that, the economy is serving a useful purpose. But as it gets bigger and bigger, it becomes its own self-justifying thing. And the game is to be a big man by accumulating money. There's no telling, where you go next. And I'm going to throw a little science in here, if you don't mind. One of my favorite topics is, I recently wrote an essay on this one on Substack called The Adjacent Possible. At any given time, the world is in a certain state, highly, highly dimensional. Every single thing about the current state of the world is defined in its current state. And it can only do one thing. It can only move to the next state. Thomas could pick up his arm. That's a change in the state. It's a small one, but you could quit your job. You could move to Costa Rica, or you could start a company. So many, and all these people collectively are making these micro moves, and they add up to the unfolding into the adjacent possible. And some of the more interesting of these are innovations and inventions. Somebody starts with a very primitive steam engine, the Newcomen steam engine. So inefficient, it can only be used to pump water out of coal mines. Why? Because coal, was expensive to ship, and it was so inefficient, unless you had extra coal just laying around, it didn't make any sense to do it. But over time, A number of people improved the engine, and that caused another gigantic takeoff when the Watt steam engine finally arrived, somewhat later in the day, later than you might think, well into the 18th century. So there's constant unfolding into the adjacent possible. But what was the pruning rule? When you look at what is the rule by which things are brought into being? It used to be, we have more food, that's good, we won't starve. But once you have financialized, commercial financialized economics, you have organizations of companies that are using scientific principles, et cetera, and you have a democratic pressure for more and more and more. The pruning rule becomes what is profitable in money, period. So when people are thinking, not quite period, because people do have their passions, right? People love their products. I always love my products. I picked products I thought I could make money at. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't, but I love my products. A lot of people just, pick something because it made money. That's the signal. And of course, that has accelerated tremendously in our last epoch. So to get back to what do I mean by radicalism? I mean taking the good from the game A tradition of learning how to collectively use information to make wise decisions, but realize that wise decisions aren't what money on money return tells you to do next. And at the same time, it's time to finally dethrone the big man game and return to something closer to our egalitarian operating system. And that's some pretty radical shit. This is really radical. If we actually did that, we'll have created a fourth epoch for humanity. And we get humanity ready to go on to where its destiny is.
Okay. So the three core elements of game A, democracy, financialized markets, and science. And all three of them have positive and potentially also negative aspects, at least in the way they are configured at this point.
If the incentives on what adjacent possible to enter are wrong, then you end up with TikTok, you end up with gambling fucking apps, you end up with opioid addiction, you end up with fast food chains making all the Americans fat and sick, right? They're not neutral. They have attributes, but it's the pruning rules of what they're used to call forth that tells us what we get.
And so the art of the successful radicalism is to position these three bodies in a relationship with each other such that they create an emergence that is directed towards infinity, right? And so that is why you add those two qualifiers in the beginning. What's the minimum that you have to change each of them? What do you have to do? And then the interesting question here becomes, how do you do that? How do you assess them? What is the actual minimum change required for each individually and then in their interrelationality? And then how do you differentiate between the minimum and the necessity, the second qualifier?
There's no solid answer. As we said, we have limited knowledge about what will come next, and we have to explore. This is where one of the other key game B ideas comes in: coherent pluralism. The idea is that we are attempting many things in parallel because we don't know what will work. How should you operate a community business in a community of 5,000 people? How should it be owned? How should it be controlled? How should it be governed? Who should make the decisions about the products? How are the winnings distributed, etc. And we don't really know the answers to those questions in any fundamental way. But if we put this in a matrix where we all agree on the goals, right, that we are aiming for the human well-being and ecological richness leading to infinity, then it gives us some hints. But if we do it in parallel, we can see what works. Second, and this is hugely important, why now? Why can we do this now? Maybe it wouldn't have been possible in 1700, probably wouldn't have been, which is we can share what works very quickly about a horizontal information bus. One of the things about information as compared to matter is it's essentially free to propagate. So you find a method of managing a business that works really good in, say, a particular kind of business. Word gets out, lots of people adopt it, they probably adjust it, change it for the local conditions, etc. And there's at least a decent chance that through collective horizontal search, we can get better at making these omni-considerate decisions. And that's another term of art, which is we don't just think about money on money return. We think about what are the attributes of every decision we make about on ourselves, on our community, on our region, on the world, and on universal history, even if you wanted to get real highfalutin about it. And we have to learn as we go. We don't have the answers. And I will say this, anyone claims they got the answer, don't believe them.
So if you look at this from an institutional perspective, right now we think of many of these three elements are subdivided into institutions. And if we think about what institutions should go away, what institutions should be modified, and which institutions should be added in order to optimize towards this more directed exploration, and we keep the goal, right? The loss function for the whole thing is infinite expansion of life across the universe, right? So if that's the loss function, what kind of institutional design or changes do we need specifically in these three elements?
Yeah. And I would modify that slightly. Single loss function is dangerous. And I believe that one of the failure modes of game A is that over time it's become more and more single dimensional. And keeping all three, I think, are important. One is human well-being. The world was actually designed so that everybody on Earth had a decent chance at a decent life of dignity and honor, irrespective of what their personal, biological, economic, or familial endowments were, would change a hell of a lot and make for a much better world. And by the way, it would make it more likely that we get to infinity, which I think is because more people can contribute, more people will be developed as rich, rich personages. Then the ecological richness is the game that we have available today. Life is amazing. There is nothing that we know of that's as interesting and generative as life. You and I and the redwood tree and the mushroom, we're all descended from Luca, the last universal common ancestor. And through an amazing series of horizontal searches, somehow all this came to be. Until we got something better in life, we better be mighty fucking careful about not screwing it up. And then, of course, the infinite is where we can go from there. But I suspect we use that as a long guide, but we focus a lot in the short term on human well-being and ecological richness, but not giving up and keeping in mind that the goal is still to be infinity. So we don't want to overly collapse on any one metric. In terms of the institutional part, this, again, inevitably has to be a learning process. What we had evolved out of the big man game. We had kings that became constitutional monarchs, etc. But in this case, our proposal, at least, is to start at the opposite end, is to realize that we're going to be small and weak and embedded in this huge, great game A, I should say. And so we should build membranes, which are small pockets of game B-ness that are operating under their own rules, have their own accords, have their own social operating systems. And I call them membranes because in the biological sense, a membrane is a container that lets some things in and other things out. And metabolisms happen inside membranes. In the origin of life work that a lot of people I've talked to are doing, there's always the question, what came first, membranes or metabolism or information? And it seems likely to me it was all three. You had to have all three together. And so let's take that idea and let's say that game B will be built from membranes from the bottom up. And the membranes will be embedded in each other. And the membranes will have accords, which are the local rules for each membrane. And they will inherit rules from parents when they want to, but they're not forced to. Other key ideas in the institutional structure is subsidiarity, which is a very interesting idea, came from the Catholic Church. I'm no Catholic, used to be, not anymore. That decisions should be taken at the appropriate level for that decision. It suggests that particularly in our political sphere, but also in our economic sphere, decision making is pushed way too high up. One of the silly little example, I live in a beautiful little town in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. It's kind of it's got a little entertainment strip with some restaurants and bars and clubs and stuff. But because of Virginia state law, you can't take a drink from one place to another, right? Virginia has stringent state level law that no public drinking. I've lived in other places where it was legal, but those were places that had local options, and the counties and the towns could decide what they wanted. Virginia does not have that option for that particular thing. It's a minor issue, but it just, to my mind, is unbelievably stupid. Why does somebody 300 kilometers away care if I take a drink from bar 1 to bar 2 walking down the sidewalk? None of their goddamn business, right? And so this idea of subsidiarity as an organizing principle should be applied to essentially all institutional design. That, by the way, does not mean no hierarchy, right? At the very top, the highest level, our atmosphere as a waste dump. There's only one way to manage the greenhouse gas impact on the atmosphere, and that's globally. We all have to agree to play fair and play by the rules and do what we're supposed to do. So it does not mean everything gets pushed down. It means everything gets pushed down as far as it can be and should be pushed down. And I think that is a huge change, particularly against the pressures that gigantism, particularly financial gigantism, but also political gigantism, have put into our world. What else do we talk about? And this is huge. This is huge. But it's a little bit off to the side, but I think people find this interesting. People often ask me, well, why hasn't this happened before? Why didn't this work? Key reason, it's too goddamn hard. If you try to go against the grain of a society, 1 or 2% of people might be able to do it because they're just cast iron sons of bitches, right? But most people get worn down because they're not getting the status gains, they're not getting the ease of life. Everything is hard. When they're sick, they can't afford a doctor, etc. And okay, later. And so we call those the adverse currents. When you're swimming in game A today, if you're trying to do the right thing, there's a good chance you're going to get your head bashed in by, not because somebody doesn't like you, but just because the way things are organized. Within the membranes of game B, you're in a game B membrane when doing the right thing feels like the right thing, not like the wrong. And we would certainly use that as a tuning mechanism in this horizontal search space. Are our currents getting better? Is doing the right thing being rewarded with status and quality of life and just generally the thing you want to do the right thing? Let's give you an example. I'm going to go off on this one. It just annoys me so much. Go ahead.
There's another institutional modality that our mutual friend Trent brought into a similar conversation many years ago, and it was forking. I mean, coming from software development, forking comes very naturally, and it's a really, really good modality to systematically explore the search space, right?
We assume forking is an absolute part of game B. So let's say you have a community, 200 people, and it gets a little too big and it wants to split. So you fork it, literally, and you can decide how you want to fork it. You want to be a clean fork? You just take the current copy and make another one. They go do their thing, or do you have a relationship between the two that they co-own some commons together, maybe? So we see growth via reproduction as absolutely critical. And we even go so far some people disagree with this, but I want to retain it, at least intellectually. Game B itself should be forkable. If game B goes bad, which it might, someone should say, fuck old game B. Let's have game B prime and just take the whole thing and fork that. I'm absolutely with Trey. I may actually I don't know if I influenced him or he influenced me or we influenced each other. We've been friends for 25 years, and I think we're both in strong agreement that reproduction via forking is a hugely powerful concept in two ways. One, it provides a pathway for growth, right? Because you don't have to decide everything in one place. But second, it's a check and balance on the blight, the things that go bad. How many of these little communities become cults, right? If something becomes a cult, you don't want to be stuck in it. You want to be able to take the good parts from this thing and fork it, and nobody should be able to stop you.
And I would add another dimension, which is the delta. So you could say, okay, I'm just going to start a new community out of this community, and you could call that forking because you're naturally going to inherit a couple of things from that community. But if you think about forking as an institution, you would also be tracking the deltas,
Absolutely.
which then feeds back into understanding what might be providing more success to one of those rather than the other. And it takes the guesswork out of the question, or some guesswork out of the question.
Yeah, that's this horizontal information bus idea. Because each membrane has formalized its operating system as a set of accords, which are filed, essentially. You can say, okay, this guy, A prime, forked from A, but they made these changes, right? Come back 5 years later, see how it worked. And at that point, it's part of the commons ownership of game B, at least, hopefully the world, that this delta worked a bit better than this original, at least in this context. I will say it's very important to always consider the context. The world is more complex than we tend to think it is. And maybe the delta would not work in some other complex, depending on the nature of the soils, the climate, the kind of people. So you have to look at all these things in a contextual perspective. But very important to have that chain of amendments, essentially, to the accords.
Okay, so going back to minimum and necessary, there are two questions. What's the real difference between minimum and necessary? And how do we calibrate how much of it do we need?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that minimum and necessary are identical, but I think that's not how we tend to psychologically think about it. I would say necessary tends to be more towards a maximalist size. I want to make sure I have enough. Right? I don't want to change the deck chairs on the Titanic one more time. I want to make the big enough change that we can actually get into a new trajectory for humanity. Well, minimum, I want to think and focus on doing no more than I need to do, because we know that we as humans, particularly big men, have a tendency to self-aggrandize, be wonderful, be glorious, all this horse shit. And so I think of minimum as the warning not to take that road. But necessary to be the warning not to take the road of doing too little. So it's a dynamic tension between the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and and then now the central question is, how do you calibrate this? So you started going into the direction. Okay, why is this difficult to go into this in this modality? And some might argue that a potential step that is proposed is not going far enough, so it cannot create any traction. But the opposite could also be true. It's too far, and you want to take small steps into the thing until everybody can follow. How to calibrate those? What's
the mechanism by which it would be calibrated, we call governance, right? As part of the accords, which are the operating system for any given membrane, it also has a self-modification mechanism called its governance, which is also self-modifiable. Let's say, for instance, a simple membrane model that's trying to grow by forking. How much do you save versus how much do you spend? Right? The more I spend, the richer my life is today. The more I save, the faster my lineage can grow exponentially. And if you look at societies over time, they have varied tremendously. Some societies will save 30%. Others are running at a minus 5% deficit, like most of the West today. And in theory, at least, that's a governance question. The members of the membrane decide what setting they want. Again, on the idea of epistemic humility and lack of being able to predict complex systems, you can't be sure that the setting you chose is the right one. And it may be there is no right one. It depends on what is your current motivation. Let's say, for instance, well, life kind of sucks in this membrane. We got to get the quality of life up or people aren't going to join. So then you say tactically, all right, we're going to reduce our savings rate for a while, increase the amount of commons we're creating, quality of life in this membrane's better, more people come in. Long term, that gives us a boost, and then we can fork later and be part of the growth lineage. So these are like no questions like of this sort are easy. They're fundamentally hard questions, and you just can't say they're not. But you need to think carefully about your governance mechanisms that give you the best shot at being able to process that information. And as an aside, and this is again where Game A, this may be the one that kills Game A, is we have to pay a lot of attention to making sure that those involved in governance are actually capable of collective sense making, who can actually see the world realistically. When I look at the bullshit that goes on in the political discourse in much of the world today, it's like, how could this possibly be? How could people believe this crap? And there's something fundamentally broken in how we as humans, under the influence of money on money return driven publishing, online, you name it, TV, we have gotten ourselves full of ridiculous ideas. And one of the tactical actions for Game B to have a chance to succeed is you got to figure out how to recover collective sense making in a way that those people involved in the decision making are actually people who have good ideas on average. Some of them won't, but the gradient is towards the true and the good and the beautiful. I've thrown out one possibility called liquid democracy, for instance, where instead of having Congress people or elected delegates on one extreme or direct democracy on the other, where like a typical commune might have its Saturday meeting where everybody decides everything together. It's a mess. Under liquid democracy, the idea is each of us have tokens, let's say for education, for agriculture, sewage, for housing, etc. And we can allocate our token to somebody else in our community to vote our proxy. I go, Thomas knows a hell of a lot about building materials. I'm going to give him my building materials proxy. He votes my building materials proxy, and he votes a bunch of other people's business, building materials proxy. But here's the key. I can always revoke my proxy, and I can vote it myself if I want. Now, I've written several essays on this topic of liquid democracy. I also warn that it's a complex adaptive system, and you better try it at a small scale before you try it on a nation state. But that's an example of a governance modality that might allow for better collective sense making. Because I don't have to learn about building materials. I trust Thomas to learn about building materials. On the other hand, I've only given Thomas authority to vote on building materials. I have not given him authority to declare war or to raise taxes or anything else. Right? And so I think these kinds of innovative and thoughtful ways of doing governance that aren't just the cookie cutters that we're used to are going to be part of building Game B.
Okay, here's another one. I once heard Tom Chi. You know Tom Chi? Of Tom Chi?
I don't
He
think so.
used to head Google X,
Okay.
and in that capacity, he was obviously working with a lot of innovative crews, innovative teams or startups, and he once heard him say that the central single predictor for success for a startup is rate of learning.
Absolutely.
And in the context of what you were describing around all of these institutional dimensions, I think rate of learning could be a really good abstract measure
Right, like
of a certain aliveness of the system itself, or even beyond just how alive it is, whether it's directionally trustable, could be a function of its rate of learning. Now, there's two questions in here. One, would you agree that rate of learning is a central important metric? And if so, what does it indicate? And the second one is how do you see rate of learning evolving over time within a membrane? Does it go into saturation, or does it stay linear, or is it superlinear?
I like this. This is a good one. I'm going to be a little bit contrarian and say not necessarily is it the best metric. Let's take the example of Facebook. It gets better and better at manipulating people and getting them to stay on forever. Or TikTok, even more examples. So it's getting better and better. It's learning like a motherfucker. But its pruning rule is wrong. It is not uh, applying its learning to the right things, for the things that are going to be pro-social. So I think you can say that if you are targeted on the pro-social somehow, then you should learn as quickly as you reasonably can. Though even that has a second order thing, and I think we're seeing this in our society today. Humans are animals, right? We evolved for a very long time. We have attributes. Rate of change is one of the things that we probably have limits on. And when you're changing things too fast, people become unhomed. They don't feel like this is part of their world. I know a lot of people, particularly young people, just feel lost today. And I think part of it is our society is learning too fast. And the term I use for that is viscosity and fluid dynamics. You know, how thick is the fluid? So how fast do things change? So I'm going to push back on this a little bit. I think there's certainly
Interesting.
cases where fast learning is good, but it depends on what you're trying to optimize for. Trying to optimize people to spend 3 hours a day on TikTok, not good. I'm going to add a complement, though, perhaps, that will work, may address this, and that is intellectual honesty in all things. And so if I am pushing for learning as quickly as possible and I'm intellectually honest about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, I think the chances of us doing it for a wise reason improve. I'm going to have to think of a third one. We obviously need a triad. We always need a triad. So we have, learning at the appropriate rate. We have intellectual honesty in all things, and we have some third thing. Maybe it's just wisdom. For a long time, I poo-pooed the word wisdom. There ain't no such thing as wisdom. A bunch of goddamn hippies, right? In reality, wisdom is very simple. Making the right decision at the right time in the right place. That's all it is, right? So don't let wisdom buffalo you into thinking that it's more than it isn't. It's hugely important, most important thing there is probably. So maybe wisdom's the third piece, whatever that is. Or maybe the result is wisdom.
Okay, so rate of learning only makes sense if the loss function is attuned to something that doesn't, let's say, like now, exploit the foundations of our own existence, for example. So we have to be careful about what we learn fast towards, and we have to understand where the minimum and the necessary boundaries for the rate of learning might be. And so what if we applied this wider context? So the if you're continuously learning not only about what's happening in the membrane, but also what the membrane, all of the interactions of the membrane with its surroundings, and you're learning simultaneously around that too. This would potentially create a feedback into the membrane that can recalibrate the loss function of the membrane towards and also regulate viscosity. Because for some reason the effect might be detrimental to the survival of the membrane itself, So it starts slowing down.
And I think this is a very powerful concept because membranes belong to membranes. I can give the simple example. Suppose that we're in a river valley and there's 20 villages that do organic agriculture, and they come together to form a marketing agricultural cooperative of which they all belong, right? And only their organic food businesses belong, and they set the rules for that membrane. And if the relationship between the upper level membrane and the lower membrane isn't correct, then there's going to be dissonance and people are going to be suboptimized. Let's say, for instance, for some reason, the upper level agricultural cooperative membrane wants people to change the crops they grow every year. And maybe they have some reason they think that's the right way, but it's going to make life more difficult for at least some of the lower level membranes. And we would hope they would push back and there'd be a governance mechanism which says, nah, we don't think so. Here's how we decide. We decide that, a few of us are going to change our crops each year to have some more diversity and reduce ecological risk and things of that sort. But, most of us are going to continue to grow the crops we usually grow. And so there's a governance stack and tension that has to come into focus over time, I think, to get this right on all these questions. What are the answers? But also the meta questions, like what is the viscosity? There is no right answer. I think that's the very important takeaway. There is feeling your way towards the answer in a high dimensional context, whereas many of the dimensions that is reasonably to consider are considered.
So life does an interesting thing in its growth. It grows exponentially in the beginning, then it becomes linear, and then it goes into saturation, and there's a dampening effect. If any biological growth happens in that curve. Might that be a good generalizable heuristic that there is the necessity for fast pickup, for fast takeoff, and then also a landing? If there's no landing occurring, then something is wrong, and
Maybe.
we need to recalibrate.
Maybe. It depends on what's the nature of the adjacent possible. Let's say our current adjacent possible produces desktop fusion, right? And suddenly we have as much clean energy as we could possibly want. The nature of that S curve is very different than in a world where it's kind of hard to get solar energy to work correctly. It's very capital intensive, requires exotic materials. Well, you're going to fix that for us, I think, and such. So again, it's context dependent. I wouldn't want to say that it always does an S curve. It depends on what is the realistic adjacent possible and which parts of that adjacent possible do we choose to do. For instance, we as humanity might choose not to use desktop fusion. We might decide that having that much power at this current level of wisdom would be fucking stupid, right? That we're not really ready for it. 10 or 12,000 watt society is all we can actually handle right now. As an example, the other answer might be, we want 100,000 watts per person, continuous society, and we have the wisdom to do it, and here's why we think that's true. Omni-considerate. Think about things in multiple dimensions, in multiple contexts, and then you have to decide, and you just have to realize you ain't always going to be right.
All right, so this is all extremely abstract, talking about this, and let's try and get it into feeling space. What does this feel like compared to the way we do things right now in a town, in a village, in a city, in our relationships? What's different in the way we navigate the world and our days, and in maybe some everyday examples that you can imagine that might change?
I'll give you my favorite example because I talk to a lot of women in their 20s and their 30s, and in much of the advanced West, being a young mother is not a pretty thing to be. Right? You're forced to go back to work a few weeks in the United States, get a longer time in Europe when your babies are really too young. Some people, it's the right thing for them. For most people, it's not. You're alienated in your little house or your little apartment. It takes a village to raise the family. Call me there, etc. And by the way, and this is the thing that comes most strongly from these younger women, is they did not ask for this game. They did not ask for it to be played this way. It's been imposed upon them by the money on money return machine, the status games, the big men games, etc. So if you're in game B, you're going to have arrangements that you feel you're a part of. That this is the arrangement we chose for this community. 20% of us are not going to work outside the house. We're going to be childcare people. So that childcare is built into the community as a free good, for example. Wouldn't have to be that way, but that's an example. So ownership of the accords comes first. Wasn't imposed upon me. Second, and this is gigantic, game A, especially late stage game A, wants to make us all feel insecure. Here we are, the richest society in the history of the world by a factor of at least 10, and huge numbers of people feel precarious, that they're 2 weeks away from living on the streets, or at least being broke. And in a network community, just as it was in the old days, a good medieval community, somebody fell down out of luck, they slept in their aunt's attic or something. Mentally retarded kid hold water for the blacksmith. There was a place for everybody. And I would hope that a game B membrane would always feel like a secure place. As long as you're an honest and decent person, you have a home there, as long as anybody has a home. We all have to go on short rations. We all go on short rations together. I don't continue to eat my big old prime ribs and push you out into the gutter to pick in the trash. That would just not be game B at all. And then further, this was an early, I think, insight in game B. We talked for a while about Maslow's hierarchy and self-actualization, us becoming more adept at various things. I do still think that's very important. I do think that that's a far better status game. That I'm very adept at doing embroidery, or very adept at growing roses, as opposed to very adept at buying Porsches or something. But I think we can go one step further, which is the ultimate adeptness is being someone who gives to the community in a way that makes the community itself richer. So that as you think about how you spend your time, there's nothing you have more valuable than your time. That's all you have, is your time and your attention. To the degree that you are tuning what you do in your local world to not only making things better for you and your family, but making things better for your community, it will feel qualitatively different than when it's one-on-one status games going on. So I can't imagine it feeling more different than, it's going to be a huge difference if we do it right. No alienation. You're playing by the rules you chose, much less insecurity. It's night and day.
So on a spectrum between being 100% a individualized person, one the tungsten the tungsten earthquake. So the fully individualized, seemingly independent person, and the fully embedded, enmeshed in a collective. It feels to me that this is what you're describing is in a good equilibrium between these two ends. You have some individuality in the sense that you structure and you shape your life in the way you want it, but at the same time you're also in the serving position towards the whole.
Exactly.
Right?
And
Okay.
not only, you got it exactly right, but not only is that true, but different communities may do different settings. Some of them may be more egalitarian, some of them may be more individualistic, and over time we will learn. I think it may even turn out there is no one right answer, but we have to be considering the continuation. One of the terms we use in the game B space for the freedom part of it is sovereignty. That it's one of the collapse modes of revolution is conformity, and so one of the very key ideas is that we must, each of us, maintain our personal mental sovereignty. It does not mean I have to stack up all my money chips or buy 3 houses that I don't need, etc. But I do have to be able to be responsible for myself, help develop myself, be in control of the decisions I make, take moral ownership of my own decisions, I think that is huge. Just something as simple as liking a post, right? It's a moral commitment to do that, right? And if you take it actually seriously as a contribution to some commons, some community that you're part of, you'll think about it differently than if, oh, I want them to like me back. So I think these are really, really important things. But there's no, again, I know I keep saying there's no black and white answer. If you look at the Israeli kibbutzes, for instance, it's quite interesting. They started out 1910, 1920s. Originally, they were all hardcore left-wing socialist, atheistic Eastern European Jews. And they had the so-called common purse model where all the money came into one purse. All purchases were done by the kibbutz itself. And you'll love this. In the first couple of years, they even had shared underwear. All the underwear was owned in common. And the kids were all raised in a communal crèche, etc. And then over time, the kibbutzes evolved in different ways. About 20% of them are still common purse, hardcore socialist. A few of them are kind of almost Ayn Randian hyper individualists, but a whole bunch of them are in between. I call a fair number of them Sweden plus plus, right? Where very strong collective welfare state, and people looking after each other, and nobody trying to lord it over the other guy, etc. But you still have a substantial room for individual taste and choice, what work you're going to do, etc. So it's a work of exploration to find what works for any community of people, and it's likely to differ.
All of this, to me at least, opens another can of worms that we might save for another day. I don't know how you feel, but how does one become a person that is able to hold that? Because you put up quite a high stack of requirements towards the person to actually be able to navigate this.
Yes,
And this is not trivial.
Save for another day. This is a very huge, maybe the most important idea of all, and I'm too burned out to do it today.
Yeah.
But we'll do that. It's called the personal institutional spiral.
The personal institutional spiral, and good one for our next session.